Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. I appreciate your time. Before we jump into introducing the speaker, I want to thank the East Flatbush Merchants Association and Flatbush Dojo Shotokan, located at 5209 Church Avenue, Brooklyn, for hosting us tonight. So welcome to the Cali Knowledge Bar series. What is the Cali Knowledge Bar? It is a space where each month I serve up a law tender, aka attorney, to teach the community about a topic that's applicable in their everyday life so they can make informed decisions and move forward with knowledge. So tonight we're going to cover Corporate Transparency Act 101. And our speaker is a proud New Yorker, born and raised in Inwood, a neighborhood in northern Manhattan. She is a first-generation Dominican and Puerto Rican American. In 2011, Sila obtained her Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University. In 2015, she achieved her law degree from Columbia Law School, graduating with top honors, the Harlan Fistone Scholar Award. In 2002, Sila was the recipient of the Top Lawyer Under 40 awarded by the Hispanic National Bar Association for her demonstrated professional excellence, integrity, and leadership. Currently, Sila is the Deputy Regional President of the Hispanic National Bar Association Region 2 and on the board of several nonprofits. She's also an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School. Sila's practice focuses on bank regulatory, transactional, and compliance matters for financial institutions, private funds, and other companies with a particular focus on anti-money laundering and sanctions. Sila speaks at a multitude of engagements throughout the country, presenting on the topic of regulatory compliance and fintech industry. Notwithstanding her impressive career trajectory, Sila's biggest accomplishment to date is being a mom to 2 little boys. So without further ado, I welcome our guest speaker, powerhouse Sila Acosta Grimes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sila, for being here tonight.
Happy to be here.
So let's cover the topic of Corporate Transparency Act. What is the Corporate Transparency Act?
So the Corporate Transparency Act was passed in 2021, and it requires all types of legal entities. So I'm saying LLCs, LPs, S corps, all types of U.S. entities or foreign entities that are registered to do business in the United States to report their beneficial ownership information to the government.
And what is a beneficial ownership information?
So that means who owns that entity and who controls it. So if you are a small business and you've opened an LLC that maybe you want to run your business through, you are most likely the person who controls that entity and who owns it, who has the shares or the interest in that entity. Right now, beneficial owners is a defined term under the regulations. So that means anybody who owns 25% or more of the company or who exercises what they call substantial control. That's another defined term. I won't get into too many of the details, but it's very obvious who exercises substantial control. Boards of directors can exercise substantial control. For most small businesses, you may not have a board of directors. You'll have just an individual like a CEO or a director or an executive director, something like that. And that is usually who exerts substantial control.
And why does this exist? What's the purpose of the Corporate Transparency Act and finally the Beneficial Ownership Report?
So I won't get into too many of the details because it can get very technical, but if I told you what is the money laundering capital of the world, I think most people would not think it's the United States, but most people consider it to be the United States. If you think about it, when you create an LLC, for anyone who's done it, what information do you really have to give? Not much. And so you create an entity, you can do whatever you want with that LLC, and whoever you're transacting with has no idea who owns it, what controls it, whether you're a foreign drug lord, whether you like it really, there's no information out there. Most countries, in order to create an entity, you actually have to file information with the government to even be able to do that. Most governments, especially in Europe and other quote unquote developed countries, have a central registry where they have all the information about who owns what entities so that whenever you're transacting, you can't hide. In the United States, we don't have that. We have 50 states. They all have different laws on how to create an entity. I know most people create their entities in Delaware, but still, you can create an entity in all of the 50 states. And every single state has different rules of what information is required. And so the United States was criticized many times by Europe mainly to say, well, we can't do business with you. It's not safe to do business. We have no idea what's going on there. There also was a huge influx of non-US billionaires buying up property through LLCs, and no one knows, driving up housing prices in the United States because they're buying these properties just for investment. And so the government said, we have to put a stop to this. We think they're laundering money, and we have no way of tracking if these are bad actors. So what they decided to do is, instead of changing the law in all 50 states, they decided to just pass a federal law and say, you now have to report your beneficial ownership information to the federal government. And that's how we're going to solve this issue. So from now, starting January 1st, 2024, any entities created on or after that date have to report their beneficial ownership information. And for entities that were created before then, you have until the end of the year to report your information. So eventually everyone will be covered.
Okay, so for any entity created before January 1st, 2024, they have until December 31st, 2024 to file the beneficial ownership report.
Exactly.
And who are they filing it to? What branch of government are they filing this with?
So it's called FinCEN, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They're a bureau within the US Treasury Department. And they essentially have been tasked with creating this online registry. It's a confidential registry. It's not like when you file your information, anyone can log in and look it up. It's confidential, and it's meant to create this online registry to give access to other government entities. So if you think about it, I create an LLC, I file my beneficial ownership information report on time, and we can talk about those deadlines and when you have to file it. You file it, the government maintains it, and other government bodies can look you up on this registry. So the IRS can look up, okay, Zila is filing a tax reform, but she doesn't list herself as the owner. She lists these other people. Why aren't they listing this on their tax form? You know, the government can start to reconcile different parts and try to basically regulate you.
Okay. And for the form, now, say for example it's an LLC and you have 2 or 3 members as a part of the LLC. Do you have to list the information for each member within the LLC, or just one? How does that work?
So you have to file what we call beneficial ownership information. There are 2 pieces to that. You have to file information about beneficial owners, and you have to file information about company applicants. Beneficial owners we talked about. Those are people with 25% or more, or who have substantial control. So directors would probably either meet that test of they own 25% or more, or they exert enough control over the entity that they should be listed as beneficial owners. The second category is company applicants. Those are the people who actually make the filing. So when you can go onto the Delaware government website and make the filing to create an entity. You can also hire someone like Angie to do that for you, or other service providers to do that for you. Whoever literally makes the filing becomes a company applicant. Their information needs to be reported, and whoever directed them to make that filing also needs to be listed as a company applicant. So now, what information for these 2 groups of people do you need to file? Name, date of birth, an address, which can be the company address, your personal address. I would recommend doing the company address because that changes less frequently than your personal address. And then some type of tax ID. So that doesn't have to be your social security number, but some type of identification document ID. So your driver's license number, your passport number. It could be, they used to offer an option that you could voluntarily provide your social security number, but they gone away with that. So it's really just some form of legal government issued ID number. New York State has a non-driver's license ID. Like there's a number of IDs that could work, but that's the information you file along with a copy of that ID.
And is there any type of business entity that would be exempt from filing this?
So I'll back up one step and say that the types of entities that need to make these filings are called reporting companies. That's a defined term. And it means entities that are either organized in the United States or registered to do business here. So if you opened up an LLC or some type of legal entity in the Dominican Republic, for example, you might register it to do business in New York. That's the only way you can rent an apartment or open a store. Like you need to be registered to do business here. That type of entity comes into play. You are a reporting company. If you are organized in the United States as LP, LLC, S Corp, any of these things, you are a reporting company. Trusts are not included in that definition, so I don't know how many times people set things up as trusts, but that is a legal entity by contract. You didn't actually have to file anything with the government to create it, so they don't call that a reporting company. So that's out of scope. But there are 23 exemptions to that. So I won't get into all of the exemptions, but there are 23 exemptions to this. Some of the most common ones are if you're a bank, you don't have to do this. If you are have some type of license with a state, like a money transmitter or something like that, you don't have to make these filings. If you are what they call a large operating company, which is a company that has over 5 million in revenue and 10 employees in the United States and has an office here, you're exempt. If you are a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, you are exempt. If you are an entity created to assist 501c3 nonprofits, and that is the majority of your activities, you're also exempt. They're like very weird exemptions, and if anyone has questions about exemptions, we can talk about them, but it really does pay to kind of just take a quick skim through. They have them listed in their compliance manual. FinCEN has it on the website. They give quick explanations for what they are. Some of the exemptions get very technical. Some of them are very simple. Like I said, if you're a 501c3, you're out, period. It's fine,
And is there any fees associated with filing the beneficial ownership report?
No fees. There are two main ways you can make the filing. One is to just go on FinCEN's website, log in, make your filing. Another is to hire someone to do it for you. So there are people like Angie who can help you with that. There are other service providers you can hire for, and usually it's a flat fee and they'll just file it with you. A lot of the same companies that you would hire to create your LLC will just make the filing for you for another fee. So unfortunately though, most of the time you do need to tell them what to file. If you consider yourself exempt, you need to tell them that because they're not going to make legal decisions for you like someone like Angie would, who can guide you through the process. They will probably just do whatever you say. They're just a service provider who will make a filing because they have experience with it.
And Sila, how will this new reporting requirement, how will it impact our small business owner community in New York City?
So I think there are a couple of ways. One is these are new requirements. In my opinion, FinCEN could have done a better job at reaching out to small businesses. I think a lot of people don't know that these requirements went into effect. I think we are going to have mass non-compliance, and just a lot of people aren't going to make the filings because they didn't know. And so I think people will learn over time, and word will trickle out, but many people don't know. The only way that you can be penalized or for not making these filings is for willful violations. That's the term. It's a term of art, but willful violations mean you knew that you had to make the filing and you chose not to. Then FinCEN or another government regulator can fine you, and there's all types of penalties and things that they can start to impose. But that's a pretty high standard in theory, which I think is good, because if you're a small business and you've never heard of this, then you can amend it at any point in time and go back to them. In terms of another way that this could affect you, I think, like I said, having your information on a registry, we still don't know what that's going to look like in terms of how it interacts with other governments. Like I said, Now the IRS will have access to this information. I don't know if that means people are going to get audited more or how the government is going to use that information in the background. Starting next year, certain financial institutions will also get access to the registry. So that means when you go to open in a bank account, if the information you give the bank is different than the information you filed with FinCEN, are they going to not open the bank account for you? Because you need to reckon, like those are things that we just don't know because banks haven't gotten access yet, because most people haven't made those filings yet. So I think it still remains to be seen a little bit, but I think more paperwork, more red tape, hopefully it will prevent bad actors from using LLCs to do bad things or to take advantage of people or anything like that. Hopefully that's the goal, to root out bad people and not give them access to the financial markets or, things like that. That's the goal, but who knows?
So for the reporting entities that were filed before January 1st, 2024, they have until December 31st, 2024 to file. What happens if they don't file by December 31st, 2024? Is there any sort of penalties or fines associated that the small business owner should be aware about?
So again, this goes back to the willful violation. So you have until that deadline. Once you start, I'll say this, I think there's two types of potential repercussions. One is the penalties from the government. They can fine you if they find that you willfully violated, if they find that, who knows? I don't know what their standard for willful violation is going to be. It could be there were 10 info sessions in your neighborhood and you're a small business and we know you've been getting emails. And you know what I mean? I don't know what the standard's going to be. I imagine it would be higher than that, but that could be one way. I think very few people, one thing I'll note, and I don't say this, I think you should try to comply. I think it's important to comply. I think there are potentially bigger repercussions because other government entities like the New York Department of Financial Services, the New York Attorney General, like all types of other bodies could try to enforce this law. We just don't know if they will choose to. The New York Charities Bureau, like other people could start saying, well, I've seen contracts start adding in language that says, do you comply with the Corporate Transparency Act? Have you made your filing? Do you consider yourself exempt? Like, these are kind of things that come up. And so I think there's that legal component of regulators coming after you with penalties and fines, or there's that contractual component, which is you're signing contracts. Are you complying with the contracts you're signing? Because you say I'm complying with the law, but I haven't made the filings I'm supposed to make.
Right.
It's too early to tell, I think, because the law only went into effect in January. Most people have LLCs that were formed or corps that were formed before January, so they haven't made their filings yet. So we don't know what that'll look like. One point I want to raise, and we won't get too far into it, but for New York entities, if you have a business that was formed in New York as opposed to Delaware, or is registered to do business in New York has something called the LLC Transparency Act. It means that you will have to make a copy of whatever filing you make with FinCEN with New York. We don't really know why. I mean, we know why New York is doing this because they're saying, we want access to this registry. We're going to use our own enforcement, and we don't know what that's going to look like. So I don't know what New York might use that information for. It's a big open question. I don't think the information I've talked about is particularly spicy. Like, it's not scary necessarily. And the government is pretty good about keeping confidential information confidential. So I don't think, your date of birth and a copy of your driver's license is going to be floating out there in the internet for anyone to get. But the question more becomes, do you get audited by New York for New York state taxes? When you apply for a license for New York because you want to be at a parade or you want to have a stand at a parade, are they going to look and see that you didn't file your CTA filings or your New York state filings and all of a sudden try to come after you that way? Because there are penalties for New York too. Those are the types of things. Now you think about every time a small business interacts with the government, you think about your compliance with law and whether they can enforce that.
And the New York Transparency Act, is that also in effect as of January 1st, 2024?
That will be in effect in 2026 and 2027, which is really far out, but it's coming. So I keep telling people about it because if you comply with the CTA, you will be generally in compliance moving forward. You'll just have to maybe make another filing in the future.
Okay.
But, don't wait till 2026 to think about it, right?
So what happens after you submit the filings, right? Say we do it next week and your address changes, or I don't know, something else that you have already reported changes. Are you mandated to then file some sort of amendment or refile the same form? What happens if some information changes after you do the initial filing?
So there are some types of information. So remember I mentioned that the types of beneficial ownership information are for beneficial owners and for company applicants. If information about beneficial owners changes, or about the entity itself, like the address changes or your tax ID changes, I don't know why that would happen, but maybe something happens, then you need to update your filing. For the beneficial owners, if their information changes, you need to update the filing. That change could be everything from my address changing to I sold the company, and now, or I sold 50% of the company, so now I have another beneficial owner I need to report to you. Company applicant information doesn't need to be updated. It's a one-time thing. They made the filing the one time to create the entity. FinCEN feels that that is helpful information for them to capture about who's involved in creating an entity, but it doesn't really matter because they don't necessarily have an ongoing relationship with that entity. So they don't think that's important information, so they're not requiring updates.
So now, for folks who are not able to get access to the Cali Knowledge Bar series, although it will be available on the Cali Law YouTube channel for those folks who were not able to make it in person, but is there any other resources available, either provided through non-governmental organizations or the government itself or nonprofits, where people could access more information about the Corporate Transparency Act, and if they need help in terms of what information is necessary for the filings?
So I would say FinCEN itself, the government agency, has a lot of resources. They have a YouTube channel, so there's some information there if that's how you best consume information. They have a compliance guide, and in the handouts I put the email, like kind of the website for that. They have a full compliance guide that breaks everything down and what's pertinent for small businesses. They have an FAQ, or frequently asked questions, section on their website. They have kind of the requirements listed on their website. So I've provided all that information. So I think most questions, you can find the answer there. It's pretty straightforward. And that's the same website where you actually make the filings. So that's, it's kind of nice that you can do that. There are some other articles online. I think the most of the articles published online are tailored to bigger corporations and like big financial institutions because they're published by big law firms. So even I've written some articles, but it's mostly tailored to like private equity or like very big industries as opposed to small businesses. But you can get answers to a lot of basic questions. I think the more complex the questions get, the more you're going to have to talk to someone like Angie or a lawyer to just give you some insight. It shouldn't take them forever. We know this. We work in this area, but for any person, I would say don't go crazy trying to figure it out on your own when there might be an easier solution.
Are there any particular industries that will be impacted more than others with this new law?
In my opinion, I think any type of industry that requires a lot of entities to operate. So I'm thinking real estate. Most people who invest in real estate don't have one LLC. They buy an LLC for each property, or that like they have a lot of LLCs. That's where these types of burdens of reporting obligations can get complicated, because then it's like, okay, well, I have 50 LLCs because I own 100 properties and I moved. Now I have to do 55, like it can get a little overwhelming. And if you don't have systems in place, you might have forgotten an LLC and done filings for 49 instead of 50. Those are the types of things where I think it can get complicated. And the real estate industry and the private equity industry fought pretty hard against some of these rules, but they still passed them. The government still passed them. So unfortunately, they lost some of those battles. Yeah.
So, in terms of security, cybersecurity, protecting your data, how, what assurances is the government, telling folks, like, how do I know that, my data is going to be protected when I do these filings?
So the government has made many, many statements about this to try to comfort people to say, your information is going to be protected. I will admit, FinCEN has had leaks. FinCEN is a very small bureau. They have, I think, around 30 or fewer employees. It's not a huge entity. And in fact, throughout this process, they actually complained a few times to the government saying, you can't keep cutting our funding. You're asking us to build a website that's secure. We need funding. And so they built the website. They've done it relatively on time. So at this point, I think the question that has been posed is, all right, probably the website itself is secure. Let's hope. Government websites. I don't think everyone's cracking and government websites every day. But what about the people who have access to the registry? What about the tiny IRS office in upstate New York who gets access to the registry? What about their cybersecurity? The government issued a bunch of regulation that if you're going to get access to the registry, you have to maintain these very high safeguarding standards. So it's not that every government employee automatically gets access. They actually have to implement these very high cybersecurity standards and like safeguarding standards in order to even get access. So I do think they're making big efforts. Again, I don't know how helpful it will be for people to log in and try to crack this website and steal your information. I don't know. I'm also not a criminal, so maybe I lack imagination on what they can do with this information, right? But yeah.
And looking forward into the future, how do you think the Corporate Transparency Act is going to look, a year or 2 years from now? How do you think it might evolve or change within the next 2 years?
I think in an ideal world, it becomes very widely known. Everyone knows what the requirements are, and it becomes as easy as creating an entity. Everyone knows I create my entity, I make my FinCEN filing, simple, easy, no problem. Um, I think there's a world where um, some people don't make those filings and the government feels that they need to start enforcing the law or imposing penalties or something to motivate people to make these filings. That would be less ideal because then we're going to have a lot of people penalized. And unfortunately, I think I grew up in Washington Heights and Inwood. And so there are a lot of small businesses, a big, big Dominican population, and a lot of small businesses where people don't speak English at all. And so they have resources in these manuals in Spanish. They do. But I still think getting government resources to people who don't speak English is a challenge. And so, there could be a world, I think, disproportionately where people who have small businesses and don't speak English or don't engage and regularly have legal counsel are the ones who are not complying, right? And then if they're the ones not complying,
If you guys have any questions from our audience, happy to take it at this time.
it could, because my understanding is that when Medicaid, Medicare, and all kind of government assistance, including like the COVID loans, and all types of government assistance, you have a general compliance with law agreement. You sign something with the government saying, I am in compliance with law. So if it turns out that you're not in compliance with law, there could be an impact. I don't, again, FinCEN is like a 30-person bureau. So their enforcement of this, I think, is going to be pretty limited to start. But I could see that becoming a problem later. Um, Theoretically, Medicaid and a lot of those services apply to the individual, not the entity. So I wouldn't imagine that you could lose your Medicaid or something like that because you failed to make a filing for an entity. They tend to keep those separate. The entity, if that entity has any government assistance, that could be scaled back, maybe something like that. I could see a scenario like that. Still unlikely, I think, but it's worth thinking about. And again, I don't think we know how a lot of this is going to play out until the laws and the deadlines start coming forward and people start not complying.
Is there any other questions from the audience?
The goal of this act was really to combat bad actors. It was to stop money laundering, to stop bad people from being able to transact freely in the United States. That's the goal. So to me, I think it's actually pretty counter to that goal to all of a sudden start penalizing all these small businesses for something they didn't even know. And again, I really do think the standard for being penalized is pretty high. It's willful violations of the law, which means you knew what the law was and you chose not to comply with it. So again, I think that means a lot of people who just don't know, no one's going to penalize them for that. They may tell them, hey, you might get a letter from the IRS saying, hey, we saw you filed your taxes. And by the way, we noticed you didn't have a CTA FinCEN filing. You might want to do that. You know, like I could see a lot of little reminders like that in the coming years. I hope that there isn't some large enforcement where all of a sudden we see all these companies getting like $100, $300, $500 fines. You know, I would hope that that's not the case. I think it's pretty unlikely, but I agree with you. I think there's a lot of people who don't like the idea of turning over their date of birth and their copy of their ID or their passport to the government, especially associated with a business. If I am an owner of a business, but I have no control over what it's doing, right? Like I invested in a business, I own 30%, but someone else is running it. I don't know if I want to give my ID and my information. God knows what that business is doing, right? I think there's some people who are feeling that type of tension where they say like, I own 30% of my brother's business, but I have nothing to do with it. Why should I have to give my information? Unfortunately, that's the way the law is written, so I can't help you there, but I do think there are a lot of people who have hesitations.
As of right, I'm going to piggyback off of your question. As of right now, has the government has been
It's $500 per violation, theoretically accrued per day. So right now we haven't seen anybody get, so it's unclear how the government's going to choose to apply that. But they could say every day you're not in compliance is a violation. And so therefore, you know, we're going to count it that way. They could say that for every entity, that's a different violation per day. And you can imagine how quickly that racks up, because 500 doesn't sound like too much money, but it starts to add up. They could also, I will note, and I don't want to get too technical, I can get very nerdy about this stuff, but there are other laws that this Corporate Transparency Act is wrapped up into. So they could try to find you and hook you on something else, like whether it's a tax filing violation, whether it is trying to evade the Bank Secrecy Act, which is another anti-money laundering act in the government. There's all types of ways that, and I think we all know the government can get creative. So, you know, there are all types of ways you can get tripped up. I would like to think that that's not really worth the government's time. If they're looking to make money, they're better off finding a private equity firm or you know, like some big company, they're better off doing that. And everyone has limited resources. So the DOJ has limited resources, the Attorney General, the District Attorney, everyone has limited resources. So I would like to think that no one is going to waste their time trying to go after small businesses and people who are just trying to earn a living. But we all know that that's not always the case. So
is there any
So the Department of Homeland Security is one of the agencies that can get access to the registry. Many government agencies, basically all law enforcement, can get access to the registry. There is a possibility that they could try to use it for that purpose. I will say, in my limited experience, and I'm not an immigration lawyer, I should say that, but in my limited experience, every single type of status you can apply for to get some type of status here requires you to be in full compliance with the law. Any violation, parking tickets can be an issue. I mean, I had a client that the court misspelled his name in his divorce decree from his ex-wife, and he couldn't give his current wife a green card because they were like, well, you're not really divorced. We don't believe you're the same person. It was like, come on, you know it's the same, come on. But they will deny you for anything. So I do think there is a chance that if you're not in compliance with law and you're making some type of immigration application, anything could ding you. So I think you need to be very, very, very careful. I've had issues with tax filings with clients where they didn't file taxes one year, or they were married but filed separately and the government took issue with that. There are all types of issues, particularly with immigration applications, filing for your green card, filing for a visa, filing for all types of things that can be an issue. in terms of the Department of Homeland Security trying to use this to conduct raids or to identify where people without status are living, you do need to provide this information. And I think there's a level of risk assessment that people will need to make. And I think this went to your question earlier. There are people in communities that don't trust the government so much, maybe because of the countries they came from, maybe because of their experiences with law enforcement in this country. I think you'll have to make a risk assessment of what is more important to you in terms of compliance. What is the bigger risk, and what you're willing to take. I think consulting with family, consulting with lawyers, like it's not an easy decision. There were many complaints about this, and unlike FinCEN, the Department of Homeland Security has a lot of resources. So, I will say they are supposed to use and access the registry for particular reasons and with particular purposes, but the government's logic there can be pretty broad. So,
Any additional questions?
that's the only benefit, rooting out the bad guys. In terms of the benefit to the small business, you don't get bonus points for making these filings. You don't get any government credit. There could be a day where there's certain government assistance and it hinges on your compliance with these laws. Like, I don't know, that maybe that'll happen. Most government assistance, like I mentioned earlier, does hinge on your compliance with law. You have to sign contracts and agree that you're generally in compliant with law, so that benefits you. But I would say the majority of this is just trying to keep bad actors out. So theoretically, keeping bad guys from doing business in your neighborhood or keeping non-US persons from buying up the real estate market and laundering dirty money through the United States, that theoretically would benefit you. They actually have, FinCEN, this is a little off track, but FinCEN has what they call geographic targeting orders in Miami, New York, California, basically regions where a lot of foreign Chinese billionaires, have been buying up the real estate and driving prices through the roof, which has been hurting a lot of everyday people who are just trying to buy a home for the first time. And so theoretically, this would tamp that down. So that could be a benefit long term.
All right, Sila, thank you so much for being here tonight, for traveling all the way to Brooklyn, East Flatbush, Brooklyn.
I know, I'm not a Brooklyn girl, but I like coming.
Thank you. Thank you to the East Flatbush Merchants Association. Thank you to Flatbush Shotokan Dojo. Thank you so much. I hope that the Corporate Transparency Act 101 was informative, and please remember, knowledge is power.